They used to introduce me like an afterthought. This is Alexandra. She does something with investments. The tone was that polite shrug people use when they want you to know someone exists, but not to expect anything interesting from them. I learned to smile and fold my pride into a polite nod, because family is a performance, and I'd been cast as the understudy for too long. My name is Alexandra Knight. I'm not dramatic about titles. I answered a consultant at an investment firm, wife to Thomas, and the woman who still packs her own lunch because she likes the sandwich exactly right. On paper, it sounds small beside my cousin's headlines. James Knight, 3 new developments in the last year, always in linen. Emma Knight, art studio in the gallery district and pop-up collaborations that give people something pretty to Instagram. They moved through the world like press releases with legs, each new purchase a puff of peacock feathers. At every holiday, birthday, and awkward housework check-in, they'd parade another glossy brochure across the table like a weapon. The worst part wasn't the displays. It was how they translated my life into a cautionary tale. Alex has such a stable little job, Emma would coo, tilting her head as if pity were chic. James, who wears success like cologne, called my career cute once, said it with that half smile millionaires keep for people they're about to patronize. It's funny what gets under your skin. Not the insult itself, but the casualness of it. The way they made me small by insisting I stay polite while they grew loud. Family dinners became theater. The mahogany table, the clink of crystal, the soft glow of recessed lighting. Everything staged so their triumphs read like inevitabilities. James would slide photos of his latest acquisition across the table. You on me, as if my muttered congratulations were a required prop. Emma's laugh filled the room when she described how her new penthouse had a private elevator. "We have our little life," she said, "and you have yours." It wasn't a joke. It was a divider. There were other slights. The whispered comments to my husband Thomas about ambition. As if being tidy with spreadsheets is not a form of ambition. The way distant relatives would pat my hand and ask when I'd get serious. They banked their worth on visible things. A car, a mortgage, a sign in front of the lawn. I learned to read the ledger of their looks and ledger of their lies in equal measure. What they didn't know, and what I held like a private coin in my palm, was that there are many ways to be wealthy. For now, though, I kept my mouth shut and my plans close. In that silence lived a quiet calculus, one that sees more than luxury brochures and overheard compliments. The stakes weren't revenge yet. They were dignity. The right to be seen for the architecture of my choices rather than the facade of my cousin's bluster. The night we all sat down to dinner that winter, I went with a glass of red and a calm that didn't belong to anyone else at the table. It was the calm of someone who had already started to pay attention. The room was warm from the oven and soft lights, but all that heat felt distant. I set my glass down like it was the accent on a sentence I'd been rehearsing for years. "Do you remember when James bought that place on Willow Lane?" I asked, deliberately casual. I watched the napkin fold in his hands the way a veiled threat folds, neat, contained, waiting. James lifted his head, linen sleeve catching the light. "Of course," he said, the smile already ready. 3 stories, infinity pool, the whole... The developer was Sterling Properties, I said. I let the name hang there. James's smile stayed up for a fraction of a beat longer than it should have, then something in his eyes shifted. Emma, who had just ordered another wine with the practiced flick of someone who never waits for the check, laughed. "Sterling, cute name. Expensive fabric, too." I slid a little envelope across the table. It was plain, the kind you get when something matters but you don't want it to scream. Emma picked it up, eyebrows arched, and tore it open like she would a birthday present. Inside were 3 things: a crisp copy of a recent property deed, a single key on a brass fob stamped Anderson Tower, 38B, and a note typed in small, unadorned font. Managed by Anderson Holdings, tenant ledger attached. The ledger was a tidy spreadsheet showing addresses, lease dates, monthly amounts, rows and rows of numbers that added up to a kind of quiet, unflashy power. James's laugh died behind his teeth. "What is this?" he asked. "It's your new landlord's paperwork," I said. My voice never roared. Vindication doesn't need drums. Anderson Holdings manages Sterling Properties. Thomas is an executive there. I let the name land. Thomas shifted, giving me 2 beats of the polite husband smile, and then the look that said I knew what I was doing. "You mean Thomas works for them?" Emma said, and even she couldn't hide the wobble. We bought from Sterling. Sterling developed the properties James has. You're saying, that Anderson Holdings is the parent company for Sterling? Yes. I watched the color drain from James's face like paint washed from a postcard. And that the properties you've been parading around are managed through holding companies that roll up into entities Anderson manages. And that I, personally, hold ownership interests in those entities. It's strange to watch a moment when people understand something fundamental about the world and find themselves on the wrong side of it. Emma's hand tightened on her wineglass until her knuckles blanched. James blinked, slow. For all their public displays, they hadn't bothered to understand the plumbing of what they were buying. They'd been dazzled by facades and daytime drinkers' vocabulary. Penthouse, turnkey, turnkey. You're the landlord? James said, as if the word itself might be brittle and break between us. Yes. I tapped the ledger. Your summer house on Lake Marin, the townhome by the club, the studio you use, Emma, on Meridian. The lease for that runs to Sterling, which is managed by Anderson, which holds title through a series of trusts and Ps. Trusts and LPs I have controlling interests in. The Anderson Tower where we live? Listed under Anderson Residential Trust. I'm on the signature page. Emma's mouth opened and closed like a fish. This is illegal, she breathed, as if scandal were measured in volume rather than fact. It's not illegal, I said. It's called structuring assets. It's called reinvesting. It's called patience and paperwork. I let a small smile cross my face. There was a cadence to it, the kind of smile that isn't cruel so much as inevitable. You bought homes. I built homes. You liked the idea of living in them. I liked the idea of owning them. The silence after that was thick, protective, the way a room holds its breath before a curtain falls. My grandfather, Henry Knight, had been silent all evening, watching the exchange with dots of gray at his temples and a steady set to his jaw. He'd been in the room when I was a child, teaching me how to read a balance sheet like others teach birds to fly. He'd been in the room when I made the small, quiet sacrifices that look like nothing to those who prize show over substance. Now he cleared his throat. "Alex," he said, and his voice was gentle but precise enough to cut glass. "You've always had an eye for the long game. She's not being dramatic. She's being accurate." They looked at him as if he'd become a stranger overnight. He lifted his chin and met each of their gazes. "When Alexandra and Thomas approached me 15 years ago," he continued, "they had an idea. Buy well, manage better, let assets compound. Not for ostentation, but for endurance. Let's leave our family something that outlives a single headline." James's face contorted, the practiced indignant expression of someone whose script you just ripped up mid-performance. "So you," he started. "So," I said, and for a moment I let the word be a hinge, "you'll be paying rent." At that, the table finally fractured into sounds, a glass clink, the rustle of a napkin, a low laugh that wasn't amused. Emma's laugh was different now, sharp, incredulous. "You're joking," she said, "right? This is some social experiment." I thought of all the times she'd tilted her head and said pity like a garnish. I thought of James's cologne and the way he used his hands to add weight to his sentences when he wanted people to believe in the size of his life. "I'm not joking," I said, "and I'm not looking to humiliate. I'm offering clarity." I could see them recalculating in their heads. Mortgage payments, property taxes, maintenance fees. Numbers sliding into place now that the ledger sat between us with its small, relentless authority. For years, they'd equated ownership with freedom. I'd learned it was a ledger and a set of rights and responsibilities, and yes, sometimes the steady return of a well-placed investment. There was a taste of something like triumph on my tongue, but it wasn't the syrupy kind. It was the flavor of an equation balanced after a long, patient solving. I folded my hands on the table, the way someone does when the work is done, and all that remains is to watch the consequences land where they will. When the ledger did its work and the first wave of confusion settled into something harder, embarrassment seasoned with outrage, I kept going. There's an art to turning over stones slowly enough that what crawls out has nowhere to hide. "Remember the Willowcrest Country Club?" I said. "The one you brag about beating everyone at the tennis courts?" James's jaw clenched. "That's owned by Willowcrest Holdings. Willowcrest Holdings is a subsidiary of Meridian Leisure, which is under Anderson's recreational portfolio. I sit on Meridian's board." I watched his face as the pieces clicked like metal into place. He went pale, not from anger, but from the sudden understanding that the place where he practiced his triumphs was part of the same architecture that kept his house up. Emma started. "Wait, so the membership fees?" She didn't finish. The math did it for her. Membership dues were income. Income was rent by another name when the entity collecting it was owned by me. I produced another envelope because I knew how to use the mundane as a scalpel. Inside were membership agreements, the welcome letter Emma had signed when she joined the club last season, and a note, payments remitted to Willowcrest Holdings account har. The club's annual gala that they'd used as an excuse for new dresses and performative charity was run out of a management contract that flowed to companies under my purview. The walk-in closets of their triumphant lives had been filled by bricks and ledgers I helped set in place. "You own that?" James whispered. There was a new tremor to his voice, not quite grief and not quite fear. "Yes." I let the simplicity of the word do the work. "I don't own the clubhouse the way you own a sweater. I own the entity that owns it. Controlling interest, trustee oversight, management contracts. The company that hired the catering for your last anniversary party? Anderson's catering firm. The landscaping on Willow Lane? Managed by a company under the same umbrella." Emma's breathing became precise and thin. "What about the condos on Harbor View? The building our parents used to brag about?" she asked, the sentence collapsing in the middle because she couldn't arrange the shame and disbelief into a complete thought. I pulled up a photo on my phone, an old promotional shot for Harbor View, glossy and sea blue, and sent it to the group chat we'd all been CC'd on for holiday plans. On the lock screen, my name was there next to the property owner metadata. Anderson Residential Trust. Controlled interest, Alexandra Knight. The chat ping sounded small and obscene in the sudden quiet. The phones hovered like guilty animals over laps. "It's not personal," I told them. "It's property law." The words were clinical, but underneath them was the memory of years when I'd been called cute by people who never had to read a tax schedule in the middle of a winter night. Harbor View, Meridian Lofts, the Anderson Tower, Willowcrest, these are just names for legal wrappers. The wrappers hold cash flow. Cash flow buys options. Options are what people misuse as status symbols. Emma slammed her palm on the table, nails clicking. "You set this up behind our backs," she said, and there was equal parts betrayal and wounded pride in it. It sounded like a child who had expected to be the only one with a secret ice cream stash. "It wasn't behind your backs," I corrected softly. "It was out of sight, because you were looking at the paint." I felt no satisfaction at the sting in their eyes. This was not petty gloating. It was the culmination of a plan that had been quiet and relentless. I'd spent years signing my name on documents no one read, making decisions about where to reinvest, choosing tenants and terms like a chess player choosing positions. It was not glamorous. It was accountable. My grandfather spoke then, and the sound of his voice folded the room into attention like a conductor's downbeat. Henry Knight had always been the family's moral geometry. Prim, steady, the man who used a fountain pen instead of a phone. He pushed his glasses up and looked at me like he had looked at me when I was 10 and asked why dividends mattered. "When Alexandra was a girl," he said, "she used to ask me if wealth was like a hat. You put it on, and people would see you differently." He smiled, small and sharp. I told her no. Wealth is like a garden. It needs tending, patience, and the humility to know when to water and when to let something go. James sputtered some defensive thing about transparency, about family expectations. Emma's face was wet at the corner of her eyes, and she blinked them away, like someone trying to keep a private life intact in public. But my grandfather wasn't interested in their performance. "Over the last 15 years, he continued, Alexandra has done what many of us say we will do, and few of us are willing to actually do. She built something that lasts, managed well, stewarded with prudence. She understands that owning is not the same as showing off. That's why." He stopped and looked at me in a way that was not about admiration, but about passing a charge. That's why I intend to reassign controlling interest of the family trust to Alexandra. She understands the meaning of stewardship, and she will see that our legacy is used wisely. For a second, the heir itself seemed astonished. The idea of the family trust, years of careful investments, the small pile of capital that had been meant to be a cushion, being handed with responsibilities and strings to me felt like being given an old map with the most valuable routes already traced. James's face crumpled. Emma made a noise that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "You can't," James started, then stopped. Legalities don't obey the scream of offended heirs. My grandfather's hand found mine across the table and squeezed once. An anchor. "It isn't punishment," he said quietly. "It's preservation. We will not teach the next generation that loud display is the same as substance." I felt an odd lightness then, the lift of someone who'd carried a secret so long it had become a body. But there was also the gravity of what my grandfather had proposed. Control came with obligation. The trust was a responsibility, not a trophy. I had built my life on compounding returns and quiet bureaucracy. Now I had the chance to steward more than my own ledgers. The family sat there, diminished in ways they hadn't anticipated. The show they'd been staging for years had been interrupted not by scandal, but by an audit of character, and the verdict for once favored the quiet. They looked at me with something complicated. Embarrassment, yes, but also a dawning respect, wrapped in the awkwardness that follows a curtain call when one of the understudies unexpectedly becomes the lead. I folded my napkin with the same calm I'd had when I walked in. The night was no longer about proving anything to them. It was about what I would do with the power I'd been entrusted with, how I would manage not just buildings, but people who lived inside them, including the ones who had once thought themselves above paying rent. They left that night like people who'd been asked to step off a stage mid-performance, flustered, rearranging their faces to something resembling composure. For me, the work didn't end with the reveal. It began. Power without direction is a loud thing. It bangs around and frightens people. So I decided to turn the noise into something useful. A week later, I called a small meeting in the conference room of Anderson Tower. The table was the same mahogany they'd once used to brandish brochures. Now it had a new purpose. James and Emma arrived with the same careful clothes and less certain smiles. They were two versions of bravado unstitched, and there was a humility lodged between their shoulders that hadn't been there before. "I'm not here to humiliate," I said, because I meant it. "I'm here to give you a choice." I slid 2 envelopes across the table, one labeled Opportunities, the other labeled Lease Terms. The Opportunities envelope contained offers, a place in our corporate training program, a role in asset management on a probationary track, and a smaller, very public project managing a renovation at Willowcrest. Each came with a blunt caveat. You start at the bottom, you do the work, you prove you can manage the thing you once flashed as a trophy. The lease terms envelope outlined what their liabilities actually were, how the rent was structured, and the timeline for remedial action if they chose not to engage. James opened his mouth, closed it, then opened the opportunities envelope like someone deciding whether to pick up a dropped coin. Emma read the lease terms and then stared at the single line that mattered. Rent is due to Willowcrest Holdings. Failure to remit will invoke contractual remedies. She swallowed. "So, work or leave?" she asked, not sure if she wanted the work or the dignity of a clean exit. "Work, or accept the market," I said. "You can learn to be builders instead of buyers. You can reclaim some dignity through competence. Or you can walk and let the properties go back to the market." There was no relish in the offer. I wanted 2 things: accountability and the chance that the people who'd once shrugged at me might grow into the kind of respect I'd earned quietly. They chose the work. Pride hasn't been shy about disguising itself as stubbornness. This time, it took the form of apprenticeship. James reported to a project manager who taught him how to read a budget line by line until the numbers stopped being foreign. Emma started with community relations at the Meridian Gallery District, learning tenant curation and event logistics instead of Instagram captions for an aesthetic she didn't steward. The first month was humiliating in the way that honest labor often is. Calluses, early mornings, the ache of doing things you once outsourced. They were clumsy at first. They missed things. They apologized, which was new and interesting. My grandfather came by the office one afternoon and sat across from me with his hands folded. "You did well," he said. "Not because they fell, but because you gave them room to stand back up." He had the look of someone who'd watched a seedling break through concrete and felt less surprised than satisfied. There were practical adjustments, too. I restructured some of the leases to include clauses that favored long-term stewardship, incentives for maintenance, penalties for neglect, and clear pathways for tenants who wanted to convert to equity through sweat equity programs. I hired a small team dedicated to tenant education, budgeting workshops, home maintenance classes, a transparent portal so tenants could see where their payments went. Wealth, I decided, wasn't a secret ledger I hid behind, but a set of systems you could explain without condescension. The cousins' rent checks arrived like small, steady reminders of a world reordered. That should have tasted bitter, but it didn't. What they contributed went back into the properties they'd once used as props. A playground replaced rotten timbers at Willowcrest. A gallery roof patch stopped a leak that would have ruined local artists' work. Harbor View's aging elevators got a long overdue retrofit. I watched my tenants, including my cousins, receive better service and safer buildings. Justice, in the end, was less theatrical than I'd imagined. It was maintenance logs and warm water and a youth scholarship program funded by a portion of Anderson's returns. There were moments I expected to feel triumph and didn't. Walking home one evening, sandwich in my bag like always, I thought about how small habits build the scaffolding of character. Thomas joked that I'd become a benevolent bureaucrat. I told him I preferred relentless custodian. He laughed, which was a good sound to end a day on. Not everyone forgave easily. There were strained holiday gatherings and silences that lasted the length of a family dinner. But there were also evenings when Emma came by to show me a community art exhibit she'd helped program, eyes bright without the old performative lilt. James, on a different night, handed me a spreadsheet with line items balanced without flourish, a private apology written in numbers. They were learning, painfully honestly, that showing off is easy, and keeping a thing requires the slow, unglamorous work of tending. My grandfather signed the transfer of controlling interest a month after the dinner. He explained the legalities like he'd explained a chess opening. Deliberate, with an eye for vulnerabilities and endgames. He placed the trust's stewardship in my hands, and with it, the quiet promise that I would think of the future before immediate applause. The responsibility was heavy in a way that felt like fidelity rather than burden. In the end, what settled over the house wasn't the kind of gloating I had pictured when anger first warmed inside me. It was a calm that comes from being seen for what you are and then being asked to be better. I didn't humiliate my family for sport. I corrected a dynamic that had made their worth a costume. I gave them nosedives into real work and pathways back to usefulness. I reclaimed dignity for myself by insisting that dignity be earned, even by kin. Sometimes I still pack that sandwich. Sometimes I wear a sweater that has no label and feel absurdly pleased about it. The tenants' mailboxes are full of notices now, not all of them pleasant, but sometimes a thank you card slips through. Thanks for fixing the playground, or the rent portal is actually helpful. Those tiny notes feel like compound interest in the soul. If there's a moral here, it's small and stubborn. Wealth that's loud is fragile. Wealth that's quiet is durable. You can make people look, or you can make things that keep people safe. I chose the latter not because it's dramatic, but because it lasts. And watching my family learn that lesson, awkwardly, grudgingly, sometimes with real tears, was better than any applause.